the last bit, what makes an indicator a human rights indicator? Maria Green, I think, has come up with the best. There are many definitions of this. An indicator of what to measure in order to determine the extent to which a human right is being fulfilled or implemented. Very straightforward, nothing magical about it. A human rights indicator is an indicator rooted in a human right. You're trying to, but not just rooted, it's rooted in a concrete, as a implementation of a right. So a human rights indicator for the CRPD is an indicator tagged on to a human right. They can be, well, this is obvious, and I'm going to skip it. What do you use them for? But here are the problems. Only 4, but biggies. Some of the values, some of the rights, the right to dignity in the CRPD are exceptionally difficult to understand from an indicator point of view. I gave you another example before in Ed Sims of a question. Here's one from the World Health Survey on the health. How much of a problem did you have living with dignity? So it's not impossible to ask these questions, but the level of interpretation of the answers is phenomenal. My suggestion is this is where we want qualitative indicators. We want a qualitative indicator to be applied to these they're subjective in the good sense, namely, you're the one whose dignity you know, whether you have it or not, or feel it or not, I guess. So we ask you qualitatively. And this is a kind of semi-structured question. I don't think an unstructured question would do it. I think a semi-structured question would do it. When you are with others, do you believe that you are being treated with respect and dignity? Now, I invented this while sitting over there, so it's, it hasn't been field tested or cognitively reviewed. But it must be possible, maybe with 10 questions in a qualitative setting, to get at this hugely important, utterly vague, but still important notion of dignity. And all the ones in my Monday lecture in that top circle, respect for difference, and all those are very, very difficult to get. The second one is the need for proxy indicators, and a proxy indicator really is needed for something like Article 12. I just threw Article 12 into that matrix that I gave you before. The goal of a convention is just the language of Article 12. The target, well, use your imagination. The only one I could conjure up was 3 appropriate measures to provide access. 80% of requests for decision-making support were satisfied. Okay, it's a target. Indicator, well, who knows? Data source, give up. I mean, there aren't any. Well, maybe you could create a proxy indicator which looks something like this. You're looking for legal capacity, so why don't you try to find out whether an individual can do the things that a person with legal capacity can do. So you ask the indicator, the question I don't know, but the indicator is measure a person's ability to perform representative legal actions, enter a contract, whatever, that a person with full legal capacity would be able to do. It's a proxy in the sense that you would just ask one question. Can you form contract? I'm making this up. I don't know if that would be effective. But at least it would give you some information that you could then use longitudinally. Now, by that I mean you ask it as a baseline, no, I can't do it. 10 years later, can you do it now? Yes. And then you have some sense that something has happened. You don't really know what, by the way, but you have some sense that things have been realized. The last thing I'm going to talk about before your lunch, I'm going to start eating cookies because they really give me I don't know about you, but I feel really animated and cookied up here. I'll start injecting cookie serum soon. You'll never know what my next. The complexity of the provisions. This comes from a document which I gave you to read as background. Justice and what really needs to be done in these monitoring mechanism is providing a framework that does justice to the complexity of human rights. And I think that underlined phrase is the biggest challenge. It is too easy to say, and there's some people who have produced overnight indicators for the convention. Bingo, there they are, right there. To ignore the fact that the convention does not say people should be employed, period. It goes on and on and on with specific, what are called attributes, which are separate sub-rights. That's the complexity. We all know, if you don't, here it is. I'm going to skip this because I have a neat way that Fra gave me when I stole their slides of how to distinguish between the three kinds of standard indicators. A structural indicator is whether there's an express commitment on the part of the country, and ratification would be indication of that. A process indicator is an indicator that identifies, so you can measure, the efforts that are made to meet the obligations, setting up boards, creating mechanisms, whatever the process are. And outcome indicators are the actual results of those efforts. Now, Jerry isn't here, but I'm getting the feeling, just as a matter of over the course of the week, that reaffirming to my mind that it's the process indicators that are the important ones. Indeed, I think a human rights indicator is primarily process indicator. And the reason for that is outcome indicators will take care of themselves. The document, legal force of the document, is to set up the procedures that will create certain outcomes. Just a claim. There's also this, has been kicking around for some time, the three-way distinction invented by the Norwegian Mr. Ada on respect, protect, and fulfill that are sort of shades of rights. Right is to respect if the states cannot interfere with you, so-called negative right. Don't interfere with my progress. To protect, to prevent non-state agent, private sector, from discriminating, for example, and fulfill a positive action to supply resources or other things. So the respect, protect, fulfill, which has its problems, and I don't want to get into them, is often used as a way of saying that these rights actually have dimensions in themselves. Well, and these are the example which I stole from your presentation. No, I stole it from their presentation, not your presentation. Notice I took out all the other stuff so it looked like I did it. Notice how it is? Well, suppose you put, here's a simplistic way of looking at complexity. You put the structural process and outcome indicators and also anti-discrimination indicators, because it's agreed that human rights indicators have cross-cutting issues like non-discrimination. So you have those kinds of indicators, and then you have these facets of rights. Well, then you already have 12 examples or features, cells, that need to be filled in with separate indicators. And if you multiply that by each article, and multiply that by each attribute in each article, I would guess 300 to 500 indicators would be adequate. But notice, he didn't do his job because he didn't tell you what an attribute is. This slide should have come before that one. What's an attribute? Well, this is an attribute, or these are attributes. Look at Article 15, freedom from torture or cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment or punishment. That's a right. No, it's 7. Freedom, no one shall be subjected to torture. Cruel, inhumane, I'm just doing it, you could parse it differently, but that's one. Another one is or disjunctive, so it can be one or the other, to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. Sorry, that's one phrase. Or punishment. Well, punishment is actually a state action, as opposed, torture can be, but cruel and degrading treatment is not necessarily part of a criminal code or something. It's a different character, so you need all three. And in particular, no one should subject free consent to medical or scientific. Now, I could have divided free consent to medical and then scientific, but I think that's overkill. I have 4, by my count, sub-rights to this simple one. Imagine if I had done employment or education. If you do, one of my students has probably done this already with rehab, you probably end up with 40. If you look at the specific, and that's what makes the CRPD wonderful. It doesn't say, do the right thing. It says, do this and this specifically. That's what makes it potentially powerful. But those are the attributes that for each of these attributes, you need a structure, process, outcome indicator. And for each of those, you might, in theory, need to protect, fulfill, and respect. Respect, protect, and fulfill. So for each of these, now they might collapse when you actually did it, or you could discover that you could do 3 with 1 indicator or something. I'm talking theory, I'm talking about laying out the project. In principle, the complexity of the convention, which is wonderful on the side of its granularity, it is specific, creates for indicator developers a massive theoretical and practical problem. Because remember, every single one of those indicators has to be tagged to a data stream of some sort. You need to have data or it's just empty, it's vacuous. Well, we could go on about progressive realization. Just one question. What sort of indicator would measure progressive processes as opposed to processes? And PhD theses, I can just see them multiplying like rabbits. There are every single one of these nuances are challenges that the CRPD has set up for us, and it's a very interesting one. Now, I'm just going to end up with ANID. This is the indicators. ANID, the Academic Network of European Disability Experts, ANID, which has been mentioned before, did a project in 2009, and these are the categories of indicators they have. Disability rates for demographics, personal and family life, choice and control, etc. These are the categories of indicators, and these are, under choice and control, the 10 indicators that they list: proportion of disabled parliamentarians, home care services for disabled. This is their take on the exercise, but notice it's not tied to articles. It's certainly not tied to attributes of articles. It has no distinction between structural, process, and outcome, although you could probably read into it, nor does it acknowledge the 3-way distinguishing, or the 2-way between positive and negative. Some of them are outcome, like proportion of disabled parliamentarians, a very straightforward outcome indicator. You just count the number, and then 10 years later you count the number again. But some of these others, you don't. Enough help with personal care and household is a threshold issue as well. What's enough? So this, I'm not going to I'm not going to denigrate this attempt because it's a huge activity. But you could see that this is going to be, I would say that these are proxies. These are proxies for more general values, for more general goals. This is a proxy for choice. In fact, that's the way they were conceiving of it, actually. A proxy for choice with these kinds of indicators, all of which are measurable, all of which we have data for. So there's the challenge. And just to show you that I don't have I'm completely neutral.